Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The story: the forest ranger who found his childhood backpack 40 miles from where it was lost. It was late summer on the Olympic Peninsula when the creek began to count for me again, the way it had when I was small and too easily lost. I was in a government truck, crawling up a washboard service road that stitched the Doswallops Valley to a high meadow, and the day had the smell of cedar pitch and dust that the first rain wouldn't touch for weeks. Beside me lay the usual essentials, stacked and clipped: radio, field book, first aid kit, maps creased soft from use. Beneath all of it, a hush that the engine couldn't quite smother. The hush you feel when a place is about to remind you it knows you better than you know it. My name is Calder Rook. I have been a ranger long enough to know the forest by the backs of its ferns and the bruised color of the sky before lightning. I grew up in Forks when the town was smaller, when the mill whistle still called men back from lunch. In the summer of 1995, the year before my father left for Montana, I carried a backpack everywhere. It was blue, with a patchy black bottom, scuffed white along the corners, the zipper fob shaped like a little compass arrow. My mother stitched my name along the inside seam in looping stubborn thread. She wanted my teachers to know I belonged to someone. Back then, my best companion was a kid named Bren Haskett, who always smelled faintly of machine oil from his dad's garage. We wore the same battered hats that looked too large for our heads, and we had a way of cataloging things to make them less strange. Every culvert under the highway, every set of stairs behind the school, the sound a creek makes when you put your ear to the water and let it count the stones. We were not brave and we were not timid. We were exactly 9, which meant we were willing to believe that nothing terrible could happen so long as we were very precise about the world. One Saturday in late August, my mother drove me and Bren to the Ho Visitors Center for the Junior Ranger program. A handful of us trailed behind a volunteer named Ione, who knew bird calls better than any adult I had met. She led us into the Hall of Mosses, and the big leaf maples hung their beards over us, and it felt like we had walked into an underwater place where everything breathed slow. I had my blue backpack, of course, packed with a sandwich, a plastic magnifying glass, and the rolled-up kite I promised we would try on the meadow after lunch. I remember chanting to myself under my breath a child's spell against the unknown. Sandwich, magnifier, kite. I have my sandwich, magnifier, kite. We reached the fork where the trail narrows. The volunteer turned to say something, and in the shuffle, Bren and I moved a little ahead or the group fell a little behind. It was not dramatic. It was not how people tell stories about getting lost. We just drifted. The way fog drifts from one tree to the next without announcing its decision. The trail grew quick and beseeching, shaded by sword ferns that knew how to hide a footpath. We took the left branch because it looked older, which meant it must be truer. 5 minutes later, we were hip deep in the green. When we turned, there was no trail to turn onto. Only air and the suspicion of an old path someone had once promised to fix. I remember the way Bren's face tilted up, the way his mouth formed the beginning of my name and then stopped. We listened for the voices behind us. We heard water, counting. We heard a raven practicing the world's languages. We heard the long whistle of space between trees. It is difficult to describe what happens to time when you are 9 years old and suddenly unmoored. It stretches like a rubber band you suspect might snap, then snaps back in short, panicked thwops. We shouted. We didn't move. We moved. We told each other it was fine. We told each other to keep telling each other it was fine. It was almost fine, in the way a pot almost boils. The search was small because it didn't need to be large. We were found quickly, not far from the main trail, by a man in a tan shirt without a name badge, who told us to keep our eyes low and look for scuffed duff and broken fern fronds and the rail ties of roots that meant footsteps had passed there before. He led us back to the visitor's center, where Ione was crying quietly into the heel of her hand, surprised by her own relief. My mother arrived, grayer than she left the house, and held me in the way mothers do when they are angry, only because the joy is so bright it hurts. We drove to the diner in Forks and ate pancakes at 4 in the afternoon. On the kitchen table that night, she laid out all the things from my backpack to make sure the day was complete and accounted for. Only, the backpack was not there. Somewhere between being found and being fed, the blue bag with the scuffed corners had slipped away. I rummaged through the car and under the seats, then, later, under my bed. In the morning, we drove back to the visitor's center to ask about lost and found. Nothing had been turned in. Ione checked the office and the bench and the ranger desk, then led us back to the fork where we lost the trail. We never saw it again. We bought a new bag the following week with a reflective strip across the front so I'd be easier to spot, and life continued the way life stubbornly does. I left Forks after high school and came back after college because the trees had a gravity I couldn't argue with. When I put on the uniform and learned the codes and answered my first call about a missing hiker, it was Ione's voice that came into my head, naming birds steady and precise. By 2017, I had seen most versions of Trouble the Forest offers. If a person tells you about a remarkable thing, you learn to ask them what the ordinary looked like in that moment, because it is the ordinary that tells you if the remarkable is what it says it is. On that particular August day, my assignment was tame. A maintenance crew had found an illegal fire ring in a meadow used for elk viewing, and I was supposed to document it, dismantle the stones, and carry out trash. The meadow is a wide, soft scoop of land that catches the last light like a hand-catching soap bubbles. The road to it is narrow and particular. I parked at the turnout and walked the last half mile, boots whispering over dust. The sky was high and pale and indifferent. Wind brushed the grasses, and the grasses answered. It was not the fire ring I saw first, but the color, tucked into the shadow line where alder met the edge of the field. A small, stubborn blue. It was exactly the blue I had watched grow soft and dirty in the corner of my childhood room. I don't know why I changed direction, only that the blue had the same slow gravity that had brought me back to the peninsula. I told myself it was a tarp scrap, or a crushed water jug someone shoved into a bush, or the heel of a broken beach toy. My stomach knew what my mouth wouldn't admit. I reached the line of trees and stopped. The backpack was hanging from a low branch by one strap, as if someone had hooked it there to keep it from animals or wet ground. The corners were scuffed white. The zipper fob was the shape of a little compass arrow. I said my name out loud because I needed to hear it, because I needed to be a person who could witness a thing like this and remain intact. I said it again, and the creak in my head counted to 4. I put on gloves because protocol is a life raft when the water gets odd. I took photos, I noted GPS coordinates and the time, I did the math in my head. If you drew a straight line from Ho to Dozavolips, you would cross ridges and water, valleys and clear cuts and logging roads, all of it busy with the kind of distance that makes you underestimate its complexity. It was roughly 40 miles as the raven flies. As a boy, I would have told you that was a universe. As a ranger, I would tell you it is the kind of expanse where things disappear for reasons that sound reasonable when you write them down and for reasons that do not. The bag was light in my hands. The fabric had that particular feel of nylon that has been baked by a lot of sun and then forgotten by a lot of shade. The zipper moved, like it resented my touch, and then relented with a small sigh. Inside, I found a plastic magnifying glass I recognized by the crack along its handle. I found a roll of kite string with the first few inches hardened into a kink. I found a small notebook with an elk printed on the cover. I found the sandwich bag folded and empty. I found a Polaroid photo, the kind that goes gray at the edges as if the air is eating it. The photograph showed 4 boys on a bridge. I was one of them. I knew the baseball cap with the frayed bill that never sat quite right. The boy to my right was Bren Haskett, eyes half closed and a squint that made him look mean when he was only belted by sunlight. The other 2 I recognized but couldn't name until later when the names arrived at my desk while I was doing something else. Sutton, the kid who drew frogs in the margins of every worksheet, and Lou, who came from a family that pronounced their last name in a way that never settled. None of us had owned a Polaroid. We took pictures on disposable cameras and dropped them off at Thrifty and waited a week to see the world we had just lived. I don't remember standing on that bridge. I know which bridge it was because there were only two that looked like that in 1995, and this one had the patch of orange lichen on the back rail that looked like a continent. We stood there, the four of us, and what I could not stop looking at was the thing beyond our shoulders where the creek widened and flattened into the cold mouth of a pool. The current made ridges across the surface that caught the light in long lines, and for a moment I thought the photograph was smudged. Then I realized the lines were perfectly straight, too straight to be water. I held the picture back and forward in the light like that would free it from whatever was wrong with it. The lines looked like tally marks, a child's counting. Not in ink, not scratched. They were fold lines in the reflected light, the way water folds for a breath when something passes through it with purpose and speed. In the bottom corner, in my handwriting, was a date, written the way I wrote then, with my numbers leaning forward as if they, too, were trying to reach the future. The date was the Saturday we had wandered off in the Hall of Mosses. I hadn't had a Polaroid, I hadn't written the date on the corner of a picture I did not take, but the handwriting was mine. I felt that old urge to catalog. The sun hung in the same place, but my attention had shifted, and attention is what tells you what time it is. I slipped everything carefully back into the bag. I wrote down what I had seen. I called in to dispatch to record the find. Then I walked the meadow in a slow square as if I could tamp down everything that had been kicked loose. Back at the truck, I didn't put the backpack with my gear. I set it on the passenger seat the way a person might set a sleeping bird. I drove slowly. Dust lifted behind me in a cloud that gathered together into the suggestion of a body, then lost its nerve and fell back to earth. At the station, I set the backpack on my desk and answered the questions my supervisor, Merritt, asked. Precise, careful, a handwriting that would stand up if anyone else came to read it. He was a decade older and had the kind of practical kindness that keeps oddness from becoming cruelty. He told me to take it home if I needed to, or lock it up if that would help. I didn't know which would help. I locked it up. That night, the house breathed like a thing alive. It is a small house on the edge of town where the splay of cul-de-sacs gives way to pastures and a single line of firs. The floorboards have a long memory. The refrigerator warms and cools the way an animal warns and relents. I made tea I did not drink and called my mother because it was the same as counting stones in a creek. She listened without interrupting and then told me to come over in the morning, as if morning would make the world ordinary again. She was waiting at her kitchen table when I arrived, a pen already uncapped, the newspaper folded into a sturdy square. The heavy teapot sweated on a trivet, and, through the window above the sink, a robin drove itself again and again into the reflection of a sky it mistook for an opening. My mother is named Neve. She taught second grade for 30 years and knows the weight of a child's eye when they are trying to carry something too heavy for the span of their shoulders. I put the backpack on the table very carefully because the table knew my history as well as anything did. She did not reach for it. She looked at it the way people look at a photo of themselves at an age they had not owned in a long time. She nodded once, a small private gesture, as if acknowledging a joke between old friends. Only then did she unhook the zipper fob with 2 fingers and peer into the bag. The magnifying glass, the notebook, the roll of string, the empty sandwich bag. She held the photo longer than the rest. I asked her if we had ever had a Polaroid camera. She said we had not. I asked her if she had, perhaps, taken a photo of us with someone else's. She said she had not. She turned the picture and read the date in the bottom corner as if it were new information and then said my name, the way she had said it when I was 9 and late for dinner. She asked me if I wanted her to tell me the thing she had never told me about the day I got lost. She said that when the ranger brought us out, he took her aside after I wandered toward the vending machines with Bren, the way kids do when the worst is over and they suddenly remember their hunger. He asked her if she had ever heard of a place beyond the gravel lot where the creek slowed long enough to look like a spill of mercury. He said that during the search, a boy's baseball cap with a frayed bill had been found on a log near that pool, and beside it, pressed into the slick of moss, were 4 parallel lines, evenly spaced, as if someone had dragged a small rake through the skin of the earth. He told her he didn't like it, not because it was impossible, but because it asked for too easy a story. He said that with children, you must be careful not to give them a narrative that lets them leave before they are home. He told her they had kept the search radius simple and let the cap sit. By the time he brought her to the spot, the cap had already been carried away by someone who had not been there earlier. It had felt, this was his word, like being corrected. I asked her why she had not told me. She said she did not want to give me a story that might become my only story. She said she thought I would become a ranger anyway, but she did not want it to be for the reason some people go to church. After that, oddness didn't stop happening, it just organized itself. I requested the old incident report through the office in Port Angeles, and it arrived 2 weeks later. A photocopied file smelling faintly of toner and dust. The report noted the volunteer, the time, the coordinates, the names of children, the exact location of the fork, the length of time we were unaccounted for. There was a scribbled addendum written by a man with a name I recognized from a service plaque in the host station. The addendum mentioned the bridge and the pool and the cap, described the lichen like a map. It did not mention the 4 parallel lines. That existed only as a private narrative passed from a ranger to my mother and now, belatedly, to me. I called Bren. We had not spoken in a while because that is what happens to childhood companions. He runs a small engine repair shop near Siku, and his voice on the phone had the close hum of machines under his words. He remembered the volunteer's braid and her bird calls. He remembered pancakes. He did not remember a bridge or a pool or a picture we did not own, though he said the hat sounded right. He said he had not thought of that day in years and that thinking of it now felt like watching someone else's movie. I took the picture to the bridge on the Ho the next day I could manage. The road incurved through the trees like a question mark left open. The air held the cool green of a public library. I walked the trail and then the spur down to the water where the bridge crossed. The lichen, predictably, had not preserved the map I remembered. What it had preserved was itself, a new continent in a familiar sea. The pool below was darker, slower, full of the soft, tearing sound of water giving way to itself. The surface held lines in the wind like a hand holding music. I stood on the bridge and looked at the spot in the photo and did not see tally marks. I saw the old shape of my fear, and it did not belong to me anymore. That night, the zipper on the backpack whispered awake in the locker. I know how that sounds. The station is old, and everything settles. I tell you this because it is true. I was alone on late duty, catching up on weekly reports. The sound was small. It would not have been audible if I were not already living with my ears open. I set my pen down and crossed the room. The lock on the metal locker looked the way it always had, a cheap, bright circle trying to be authoritative. I could smell damp canvas and a faint sweetness like crushed berries. I turned the key, swung the door open, and looked down. Inside the small elk notebook, a page had been pulled half free, as if someone had riffled it and left it mid-gesture. I lifted it carefully. On the page was a map done in a child's hand. Uncertain, earnest lines labeled with names I would not have known when I was 9. There was a ridge labeled with its local nickname, not the formal printed one. There was a logging road noted as active when it had been decommissioned before I got my first radio. There was a ribbon of creek named by a word I had only ever heard on the lips of an old man named Ivar, who occasionally brought apples to the station and told us how long the region had been pretending to be a secret. I traced the lines and felt my mouth shape a smile I did not intend. The map's scale was wrong and its orientation shabby. It was also, in a way that did not let me off the hook, accurate. In the bottom corner, my name was written the way I would have written it when I was still erasing letters that leaned too close to one another. I turned the page and found another drawing, this one of 4 simple vertical lines and a 5th crossing them. I could not tell if I or some version of me had been counting days or counting a thing that was not days. I took the items to Merritt and told the story straight. He listened the way a man listens when he is deciding whether the thing before him is a fragile truth or a sturdy lie. When I was done, he nodded and suggested we make copies and return the originals to the bag. He suggested we tell no one for the time being. He suggested a lot of things that came down to the same instinct he had when he piled sand along a washed-out trail, his practical kindness asserting itself. For the rest of that month, I carried the backpack with me in the cab of my truck. I did not let it nest among my equipment. I did not want it to belong to anything. I began to notice small echoes. A radio call came through in a voice I didn't recognize, a woman asking for a station code that had been retired years ago. It faded before I could answer. A handwritten note from a volunteer left on my desk addressed me as if I were new to the job and needed to be told how to sign out keys. People forget. Systems lag. None of it was impossible. It was the overlay that wore on me in a way I could not explain to anyone not standing where I stood, hearing the creek count again. Then, in late September, the wind arrived the way it does here, moving low and certain, pushing the cedar tips like a hand-smoothing fur. A small storm hit the west slope, and the park closed 2 trails where windfall made walking more adventure than anyone wanted. On the 3rd morning after, I hiked in with a saw and a radio and a pack stocked with the stranger's inventory of what the day might ask for. I left before sunrise. In the gray at the road's end, the blue backpack looked black. I hooked it over my shoulder anyway. The trail was choked with the aftermath of wind. Sword ferns lay pressed flat in the shape of the gusts that had climbed over them. The air was busy with the smell of ripped wood, bright and bandaged. I worked for hours, cutting and hauling, letting gravity and inertia teach me again how to be small and safe among large things. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a section where the creek washed close against the base of a hill and slowed in a widening. The place felt like the pause between breaths when you were choosing a word. I stood a moment to drink water and listen. There was a sound like rope pulled through wet grass. I turned and saw nothing. I took 3 steps, and my boots slid on something not quite rock and not quite mud, and I sat down hard and laughed at myself, because falling is a kind of truth. When I stood again, I found that I had scuffed the thin layer of silt that had settled over the glacial stones. On the rock where my heel had scraped, the silt had been wiped away in parallel lines, 4 of them, all the same length and distance apart. Above them, a 5th, skimming across. I watched them for a long time. The creek made its rolling hush. A jay scolded the forest because that is the jay's job. The lines would not have surprised anyone who was not me. They could have been made by the branch that lay a foot to the right. They could have been made by a fish's tail in shallow water. They could have been a trick of silt and pressure. The world is busy with explanations. And still, it felt as if someone had opened an old drawer in a house I no longer lived in and left it just slightly ajar, asking me to notice. I took the backpack off and set it on a dry rock. I sat beside it, I unzipped it and took out the photograph and the little elk notebook. I laid them in my lap and thought of my mother at the kitchen table telling me she had tried not to give me a story that might replace all the others. I thought of Bren's voice with its undertow of machinery. I thought of the volunteer's braid and the ranger without a name tag who had once taught me how to see the rail ties of roots that meant footsteps had been here before. There is a moment in certain kinds of mysteries when the person at the center of them realizes the mystery is not hunting them. It is not a predator. It is not a debt collector. It is a mechanism, and it will keep moving in the dark whether they stand in its way or not. Standing in its way, in fact, makes you into a gear. I realized, by the creek, that the only way to not become a gear was to learn how to sit with the mechanism sound and resist the instinct to stick my fingers between its teeth. I put everything back into the bag. I did not hike to the bridge. I did not go looking for a cap that had been taken 2 decades ago by hands I would never know. I did my work, and I hiked out in the blue light, the hour when the deer stand at the edges of things like judges we never asked for. At the truck, I opened the passenger door and hesitated. Then I opened the back and tucked the backpack behind the seat with the emergency blanket and the flare kit. I told myself I would decide what to do in the morning. The morning, when it came, offered nothing but itself. In the weeks that followed, other things happened and did not happen. A woman called the station to ask about a lost hiking staff carved with a spiral she had traded for a set of wrenches at a yard sale in 2002. I took the call without thinking much of it until she said she had lost it on the trail where I fell by the creek, and then said, as if correcting herself, that no, she had not yet lost it. She would be losing it the following weekend, and could someone please note it so it would be easier to find? I asked her to repeat herself. She laughed, a kind embarrassed sound, and said, never mind. I logged it and didn't know where to file that particular kind of future. I took a Saturday and drove to Port Townsend, where the water gathers all the stories raindrops have learned on their way down. I walked the pier where visitors eat fish and scrub salt from their lashes, and I let the wind take whatever it could carry. I bought a coffee too hot to drink and watched the ferry pull away like a room being moved through the water. I thought about taking the backpack to Lost and Found and letting anonymity file my life into a box with all the other forgotten things. But that felt like becoming a gear, too. A different machine, same teeth. So I did something that looked, from the outside, like doing nothing. I put the backpack in the hall closet behind a row of boots. I went to work and came home, and sometimes, when the house breathed a little too obviously, I put my hand on the closet door and stood there until I could not feel the urge to open it. I did not open it for a long time. I slept. I woke. The creek in my head counted me through the winter. In early spring, when the salmonberry blooms look like small upside-down umbrellas, I took the backpack out and carried it to the Ho Visitors Center, the place where the world had first announced itself to me as something that could undo and then redo me. I waited until the desk was between visitors, and I set the bag down without telling the story. The ranger at the desk, a kid who could have been my version of myself if time were generous and liked jokes, asked me if I'd like to fill out the form. I said I would, and I wrote down what I could without becoming a gear. He asked if there was anything special inside, and I said there was a photograph I would like a copy of, if that was permitted. He said it was. I made the copy and put the original back where it belonged. I signed my name and paused, pen hovering. The kid glanced up and then back down, which is to say he gave me the privacy of my pause. I put the pen down. I turned and walked out. Behind me, the sound of the lobby folded around people as they entered and left, and the door made its small argument with the close of the day. It has been a while now. The bag left the visitor center for a time, then returned, then left again, the way objects do when they are adopted, and then set back into circulation by a life that changes the size of its hands. The photograph sits in a frame on my bookcase, its colors gently losing their nerve in the light. The tally marks I once insisted were too straight now look like the wind on a slow pool. My mother says she likes the picture because we look well in it, and because the bridge looks like something that knows it is temporary. Bren visited last winter and stood in my living room with his hands in his pockets and said the kid in the photo looked like he had borrowed my face. Sometimes I think of the boy with the baseball cap on the log near the pool. Sometimes he is me, and sometimes he is not. Sometimes I make a list in my head, the way I did when I was 9, and the list has fewer items now, but wears them more carefully. Sometimes the creek counts me to sleep. Sometimes, just before the world thins into rest, I hear the rasp of a zipper and the creak of a locker and the small slide of paper between two pages. It is not frightening. It is not a debt collector. It is a mechanism still moving somewhere, likely in the dark. I am learning how to be someone who can hear it and not become a gear. Last Sunday, I walked the meadow loop near Dos Wallops just before dusk, when the sky gathers itself and decides which gray will belong to which piece of evening. I took the path to the alder fringe and set my hand upon the branch where the strap had once hung, and the bark was smooth and cool. I could smell rain thinking about arriving. A black-tailed deer stepped out of the tall grass and considered me with the patience of an old librarian. Somewhere in the trees, a raven practiced every language. I stood very still and listened for something I could not describe if you asked me to. The wind changed, and for a moment it was air pouring over me, the old, soft wet that makes everything feel artifact and brand new at the same time. The creek in my head counted once, twice, 3 times, and then it did not need to count anymore. I let the dusk gather me in, the way a place gathers what belongs to it. I walked back to the truck. I did not look back. because I have learned that you do not always need to watch a door close to know it has. I drove home, and the house breathed like a thing alive, and in that breath there was a steadiness I had not had when I was 9. Somewhere, perhaps in a drawer I would not open, something moved a little to the left or the right to make room for the next thing. The story. Miles between the markers. I am going to tell you a story the way I first heard it. Slowly, the pieces set down like mile markers you begin to count without meaning to, and by the time you realize you've been counting, you are already too far from where you started to turn back. It begins on a 2-lane ribbon of highway that cuts through the middle of the country, the kind of road that is always either wet or dusty, where truckers know the names of the towns not because they have lived there, but because they have filled their tanks there and stood in fluorescent light paying for coffee that tastes the same no matter how far you've gone. His name was Lowell Hart, though most folks who knew him from the road called him Low. He was a quiet man from the low hills outside of Poto, Oklahoma, who had spent 20 years watching America lope past the edges of his windshield. He was not a man given to dramatic stories. He liked long, steady runs overnight because he said they matched the pace of his thoughts. In the fall of 2013, when this happened, he was hauling palletized drywall sheets eastbound from Amarillo to a distribution yard outside Little Rock. Late October. The kind of week when the last warm days give up without argument and frost starts to hold the grass in place at dawn. He left Amarillo at a little after 9 in the evening. The sky that night had the dull shine of a nickel, the moon veiled and far away. There was a front sliding down from the panhandle, and the weather people on the radio were careful in that way they are when they know they are guessing. The forecast hung on a knife edge between rain and nothing. Lowe had a thermos of coffee and 2 ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and in the driver's footwell, an extra pair of wool socks. He liked to be warmed from the feet up. By the time he hit US 62, the wind had started to worry the grasses. He tuned the CB just to hear other drivers talking to no one in particular. He liked the reassurance of voices. Outside Albany, the first drops came, a light scatter that rode the chrome and made the road stripes glow. It was the kind of rain that made the world into watercolor, but it did not try to push him around. He was somewhere between Kyoto and Spiro, the hour passing 2 in the morning, when he saw the hitchhiker. She stood in the near shoulder light of the high beams, not quite in the road, not quite out of it, wearing a gray peacoat with the collar turned up and a knit cap that had once been bright. Her hand was not extended in a classic hitch. It hung at her side, a small canvas bag slung across her body, the strap cutting the coat into 2 neat halves. Lowe had rules about hitchhikers, made in the beginning when everyone warned him about every possible thing, but those rules had softened over time. He would never pick up anyone when a child was involved, and he would not stop for groups. He would sometimes stop for a single person, late, in the middle of nowhere, under weather. He slowed from 60 to 20 before the decision had made itself. He put his hazards on and eased the rig to the shoulder, the right tires settling into the gravel. The wipers worked, and the engine idled, and the rain ticked its light song on the windshield. She did not move at first, as if surprised by her own luck. Then she came up to the passenger side and opened the door with an easy familiarity, as though she had done this before. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm, a little tired. "I didn't think anyone would stop." Her name was Ada. "Not short for anything," she said, "just Ada." Up close, she was younger than he had thought, not past 30, though her eyes had the long-distance look of someone older. She smelled faintly of wet wool and the kind of soap people use when they live near rivers. She sat with the canvas bag on her lap, both hands on it as if it had something fragile inside that should not wobble. Lowe nodded, and she nodded, and there was a pause that opened like a door. "Where are you headed?" Lowe asked. "East," she said. "As far as you're willing. I'm trying to get home." He told her he could take her as far as Roland, near the state line. He lived up the road and would be turning off long before Little Rock. She said that was fine. Her voice had that carefulness people use when they are afraid of being a burden. He turned the heat up a notch and handed her a paper cup of coffee from the thermos lid. She held it with both hands. The rain found a steadier rhythm, the road smell rising like a memory from the blacktop. They drove. For a while, the truck's sound and the wipers were the only voices. Ada did not offer the usual trail of hitchhikers' reasons, and Lowe did not ask for them. He had learned that most people will tell you what they want to tell you when the road stretches and time has its say. "You've been out long," he asked finally, a question that could mean anything. "A few days," she said. "I was in McAllister. I was in Henrietta. I lost a ride at a truck stop with the blue awning and the sign that flickers." "It's funny what you remember." She smiled without any lightness, as if she were observing her own joke. "I'm trying to get home to Hartfield. You know it." Lowe shook his head. He thought through the map in his mind, the one with its own weather and landmarks. The name made a small ring and did not settle. "It's out near Roland, as you said," she added. As if she were embarrassed, she had asked too much geography of a stranger. "There's a post office there with a flag that catches on the pole in the wind. People complain about the noise, and the postmaster oils the rope, but it keeps happening anyway." Lowe had passed that post office 1,000 times and had never heard the flag catch, but in the way of the road, where names and stories map onto your own places without warning, he believed her entirely. He pictured the yard light on a metal pole, the humming transformer, the kind of porch where shoes are left under an iron chair. They talked about weather next. When you are traveling with someone you do not know, weather is the safest shared creature. Ada said she liked the way the air felt before a storm, heavy and gentle at the same time. She said it reminded her of the time when she was 8 and the creek near her house had flooded and everything smelled like earth and iron. Lowe told her about driving through a whiteout in Wyoming in 1999 when the only way he knew he was still on the road was that the rumble strip did not buzz and the ghost of his trailer lights showed in his side mirror like a second thought. They did not have to pretend to be impressed by each other. The night was long enough that even simple stories found their proper weight. At mile marker 34, where the land opens out briefly like a yawn and you can see the silhouette of the water tower 2 towns over, Ada set her cup down and asked Lowe if he had ever gotten the feeling that he had arrived somewhere before his body. The question floated in the cab and sounded stranger than it might have if the radio had been on or the rain louder. Lowe thought about it carefully, the way he always did. He was not the kind of man who said yes just to be agreeable. "I have felt late," he said, "and I have felt early. I have not felt what you said." She nodded, not disappointed. "Sometimes I think I am already home," she said quietly. "Just the rest of me is catching up. And sometimes I think I am always 5 minutes too late." They fell quiet. The road shouldered them forward. Lowe watched the reflection of the yellow center line play along the chrome bracket of his passenger mirror. Ada turned the canvas bag slightly, as if to relieve it of the most delicate pressure. He thought he saw on the edge of her glove a frayed place, a little unraveled ladder of yarn that she had attempted to stop with a knot. Near Salisaw, the rain thickened. The space between the drops disappeared so that the road became one thing. The truck's cab felt smaller in the best way, like a room holding weather at a courteous distance. They slowed to pass the shadow remains of an earlier accident, a scattering of orange cones and a wet mark on the shoulder where someone's vehicle had bled its radiator into the earth. Ada looked out toward the trees. "There was a wreck out here last week," she said. "I heard it on a scanner at the diner. It was a small note. Woman eastbound. Late. The way it is said, matter of fact, but still, like a hand placed flat on the table." Lowe did not ask how she knew that. Small towns talk the way water does, quietly and persistently, and there are a dozen ways for the details to reach anyone who is listening. He kept the truck steady and let the engine do its patient work up the shallow grades. He felt the odd sense that he did not want to break the moment in which this stranger trusted him enough to say something that sounded to him like grief. It was close to 3 when they rolled under the orange light of a truck stop canopy at the Roland exit. The rain came straight down, a curtain of it. The diesel pumps stood like sentries, the digital numbers awake and already bored. Lowe pulled into a lane and set the brakes. The hiss filled the cab and bled away into a calm. He had intended to offer to take her a little closer to Hartfield if it meant much to her, but she was already opening the door. "This is good," she said softly. "Thank you. It's better to walk the last bit." She moved like she had been practicing, and Lo wanted to say that the night was not a thing to go out into on foot if you could avoid it, but something about the way she looked toward the rain, attentive and unafraid, stopped him. "Take the bag," he said, though he knew she would, and she smiled at the ordinary kindness of that. She paused with one foot on the steps. The dome light carved her from the dark, made the knit of her hat almost shine. "If you ever pass mile marker 31 again," she said, "look to your right. There's a low white cross near the fence line, back where the grass grows in a little slant. It goes unnoticed because it is humble. That's home for now. You'll know it when you see it." Before he could think to ask her what she meant by home, she was gone. Into the rain, the canvas bag pulled close, the gray coat buttoned as far as it would go. He watched her walk across the shimmering concrete, her reflection beneath her like a second person that stayed attached a beat longer with each step. She did not go into the store. She did not go toward the payphones. She crossed toward the low place where the lot fell away into a black ditch and the suggestion of a road that locals use without ever calling a road by name. Lo took a breath he hadn't noticed he'd been holding. He turned off the wipers and listened to the rain find the different notes of the cab. He sat there for a full minute, not sure why, the way you sit still after your own dog has gone into the house and you keep looking at the spot where it had been. Inside the store, the night clerk, a man with a broad face and a last name embroidered on his shirt so worn the letters were fading, asked how the road was. Lo said it was manageable. He bought a fresh coffee and a package of peanut butter crackers he did not really want. The clerk looked toward the pumps, then back at Lo, and said, "You know, there's been 3 rigs pulled into this lot in the last week, with the rain sitting on their roofs like that, and the drivers telling me they picked up a girl down the way. They all had the same tired look. You got that look." Lo said he had given a ride to someone. He kept his voice neutral, as if the facts might scamper away if he spoke too quickly. The clerk nodded, as if they had both agreed to stand on the same square of floor. "She going to Hartfield?" the clerk asked, and the way he said it made it less a question than a test of something unsteady in the air between them. "She said home," Lo answered. "Said there was a cross at 31. The clerk watched the rain for a while. He touched the edge of the counter with the tips of his fingers. "2 Fridays back," he said. "Careful. A woman died at 31. Single vehicle into the fence. No one was drunk. It was wet like this. She was going home. Name was Adeline, I think. They said Ada. People been seeing her since. Word gets around." Lo did not laugh. He did not disbelieve. He did not do the things people in stories do when something brushes the surface of the world like this. He asked quietly what her last name had been, and the clerk said Unwin. The sound of it fell into Lo's chest and settled like something with a specific weight. He left his money on the counter and went back out. He expected nothing in particular and was not disappointed by it. The truck's cab had kept its small, particular warmth, and the smell of Ada's wet wool still hung in the air, a thin filament of life. He sat with it for a while, and when the feeling slipped away, like any scent does, he started the engine and pulled back onto the road. When dawn came, slow and bleached, he took the long way home. He did not like to intrude, and he did not like to make grief into something to chase, but his hands turned the wheel toward 31 as if they recognized a duty before he did. He eased off on the shoulder and set the hazards. The rain had calmed into a fine mist, a breath more than a weather. He walked along the fence line until he found the cross. It was small and white and simple, 2 boards hand-cut and secured with a pair of screws that were not the same size. The grass had been pressed down around it in a half circle, the way it is when people stand with their arms around each other and their feet leave a pattern. There were 3 wildflowers folded beneath the cross at its base, their stems still pliant, not yet dry. There was a ribbon of yellow, the kind florists use, tied once and left to fray. On one of the boards, neat, careful black letters spelled a name, Adeline Unwin. The date written out was October the 18th, 2013. 5 days earlier. Lo stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and felt the wind gather itself into a small shape that moved along the fence and passed him by, unbothered. He did not speak. He did not think he needed to. He noticed that the fence itself had a place where the wire had taken a kink and then been pulled straight again, a wrinkle still visible, almost a scar. He imagined the people who had bent to hammer the cross in. He imagined the sound of the day then and the smell of it and how quiet it had been after everyone left. He drove home and slept for a few hours in the manner of men who are able to make sleep whenever there is time. When he woke, the house was full of that afternoon kind of light that makes even dull rooms gentle. He made tea instead of coffee, and he turned the local radio on low. They said nothing about anything that mattered to him. He sat at the table and opened his wallet and found a receipt from the truck stop and wrote the name on the back of it in ballpoint so he would not ever be tempted to let it be one of those details that time steals. A week later, on a clear night that already knew it would freeze by morning, he took the same route east. It was not a special pilgrimage. He had a load and a schedule. But he found himself looking at the right side of the road as he approached 31, not because he believed he would see her, but because it had become a way to steady his thoughts. The road was dry, and the stars were brighter than made sense. He set the cruise and let the engine hum, and he passed the mile marker, and he looked to his right. In the shallow wash of his headlights on the fence, the ribbon on the cross caught the light and moved. He might have believed it was the wind. He might have believed it was the difference between the speed of the truck and the stillness of the world. He did not do the arithmetic. He let the image be what it was, and he drove on, and he promised himself that he would check his passenger footwell later. There was no reason for the promise. It was just the kind of small bargain you make with yourself when something has touched the everyday shape of your life. When he checked at a turnout with a picnic table where the grain trucks stop in summer, he saw the thing he would carry with him for a long time. In the well, where a pair of spare gloves usually lived, was a small rectangle of paper. He picked it up and felt the fiber of it, a solid postcard like the kind you buy at a small-town museum. On one side was a photograph of a river bend with cottonwoods leaning. On the other, in careful handwriting, a message with only 2 words, "Thank you," and the initials A.U. He turned it over again, and his thumb left a dark print of road dust on the white edge, and he felt the smallest thing inside him, some mechanism that had been buckled into place for decades, relax one notch. He did not tell many people. He told a man named Vogel, who had been his friend since they had gotten their first routes in 1995. Vogel listened with his head bent, his eyes on the table, the way men listen when they are not deciding whether you are telling the truth, but whether they are worthy of it. He told the night clerk again the next time. The clerk nodded once, slow, like he was filing the detail away in the right drawer. Low kept driving. He kept noticing, in the months that followed, that sometimes a smell would rise in the cab out of nowhere, a green smell like wet wool, and he would feel a pause in the usual forward rush of time, just a breath long enough to remind him that he was a person inside a world he did not entirely understand and did not have to. Once, on a bitter January morning, when explosions of ice cracked in the ditches and the tops of the fence posts wore a thin skin of white, he passed 31 and found, not the ribbon moving, but a little crescent of footprints in the frost where someone had stood facing the cross. The prints were small and very close together, as if the person who made them had been standing perfectly still, looking down. There were no prints leading to or away from them. The sun took them by midday and left only the memory of shapes in flattened grass. 3 years later, he was in a house he had moved to with a smaller yard and a deeper porch. He had tried not to account for changes. He did not pretend you can hold the road steady. He had kept the postcard in the glove compartment of each truck he drove, transferred careful as a document. One evening, early summer, the air hot and friendly, he found a little packet in his mailbox, no return address, the stamp slightly off-kilter. Inside was a photograph, black and white, of a woman standing on a porch with a canvas bag crossbody and a knit cap in her hand. She was not smiling. She had the look of someone steadying herself against something only she could feel. On the back, the words Hartfield Harvest, 1998, and, in a different pen, the same 2 words as before. Thank you. He kept that too. He did not ask for more, and more did not come. Sometimes when drivers talk, after midnight, in that drifting way stories move through CB waves, they say there is a mile of road near Roland where the heavy air keeps a small echo of the people who have needed it. They say a man stopped once to pick up a hitchhiker who wasn't alive, and he did not get scared in the way that makes a person do something foolish. He just kept the night company the way it had kept him, and afterward, the world was not bigger, exactly, but it had a new room he had not noticed before. Lowe still drives past the markers. He still looks to the right at 31. He has not seen Ada again. He has a habit now of keeping a spare paper cup ready, turned upside down so dust does not make it unkind. Sometimes he thinks of how she said home, the way we say things when we imagine that if we keep speaking them, we will move closer to them. And sometimes he thinks of the clerk's careful hands on the counter, and Vogel's listening, and of the postage stamp slightly crooked, and of the black letters on a white board in the grass. He does not puzzle it the way some would. He lets it live beside him the way certain songs from childhood do, a thing that belongs not because you have proof, but because leaving it out would mean the world had one less true piece. On a spring night, when the Thunderheads were still learning the shape they would take that year, he pulled into a rest area and cut the engine and listened to the sound the world makes when you have not asked anything of it yet. In the silence that followed, he could hear the fabric of the seats cooling, the tread of a truck pulling away 3 spaces over, the small, inquisitive call of a bird in the grass that could not decide if dawn had arrived. And under that, a memory of rain and a voice saying thank you, and the knowledge, quiet as a road at 3 in the morning, that sometimes the life we think we are living is accompanied by another life running just next to it, close enough that when we reach out without quite meaning to, our hands brush, and for a moment, all the miles between the markers feel like the same place. A few times each year, now, when the season turns and the road smells like water and iron again, he drives the long way to Little Rock and stops at the truck stop with the light that makes everything look like it is happening in an old photograph. He buys coffee, he will only sip. He stands at the edge of the lot where the concrete breaks and looks toward the dark cut of the ditch and the suggestion of the old road. He says nothing out loud. There is no need to narrate what you already know. When he climbs back into the cab, he places his hand for a moment on the canvas of the passenger seat and feels that it holds a faint warmth, the kind that could be from sunlight through glass or from the memory of someone sitting there. And he allows himself to imagine that what we offer each other, even when it is small and unremarkable, is enough to carry someone the last mile home. He turns the key, and the engine finds its voice, and he pulls onto the highway that does not belong to anyone but is used by everyone, and the truck takes up its steady, patient song, and the night, as always, opens.